The senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I rise to discuss Amendment 3016. This is an amendment that would eliminate the corn ethanol mandate from the renewable fuel standards that we have. And I want to thank my co-sponsors on this amendment, Senators Dianne Feinstein from California, and Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona. This is a bipartisan amendment, and I think this is a really important issue. What this amendment does is it eliminates the corn component of the renewable fuel standard. The renewable fuel standard, as you know, Mr. President, was created in 2007, and this is a federal mandate that forces drivers to burn actually billions of gallons of biofuel, the vast majority of it derived from corn, in our vehicles, in our cars. It's on the order of 100 billion gallons of corn ethanol, and because this mandate establishes specific and increasing quantities of ethanol that has to be burned in our cars, when total gasoline consumption stays flat or declines, then it becomes an increasing percentage that we're all forced to buy. Now, let me be clear about one thing. The amendment I'm specifically addressing, 3016, eliminates the corn portion of the renewable fuel standard mandate. That's, I said, 80% of this. The optimal policy is get rid of this whole thing. It was a well-intentioned but bad idea to begin with. It's now abundantly clear this is bad policy. We should get rid of the whole thing. But I understand we don't have as broad an interest in getting rid of the whole thing as the interest we have in getting rid of at least the corn component. And since that is, after all, 80%, this would be significant progress. There's probably not an enormous universe of things on which I have agreed with Vice President Al Gore on over the years, but he got this right. Vice President Gore has acknowledged that ethanol was a mistake in the first place. It was created, as I say, with all good intentions. It was thought that by forcing people to make ethanol mostly from corn and burn it in our cars, we would reduce air pollution. It was thought that it would reduce costs for families. It was thought that it might even be good for the economy. All three are completely wrong. Factually, that is not the case. The mandate has failed to achieve any of these goals, and instead, in fact, it increases air pollution, it increases costs for families, and it is harmful to our economy. Let me take the first one, because the real motivation for this was to do something to improve the environment. The real idea behind ethanol, the impetus in the first place, was that we would reduce air pollution if we're burning ethanol derived from corn rather than gasoline. Well, unfortunately, it hasn't worked out that way. And this isn't just my opinion. There's plenty of documentation. In 2009, Stanford University predicted, and I quote, "Vehicles running on ethanol will generate higher concentrations of ozone than those using gasoline, especially in the winter." In 2011, the National Academy of Sciences observed, and I quote, "Projected air quality effects from ethanol fuel would be more damaging to human health than those from gasoline use." That's the National Academy of Sciences. In 2014, Northwestern University researchers, they did a little research on the real world. They went down to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where they had recently required an increase in the use of ethanol. And what did they find? A corresponding significant increase in ground level ozone, which we all know is a harmful pollutant at the ground level and causes smog and other health problems. So there's no dispute about this. There's no question about this. Ethanol is harmful to our air quality and our environment. The Environmental Working Group agrees. The Environmental Working Group, a group of environmentalists, have said, and I quote, "The rapid expansion of corn ethanol production has increased greenhouse gas emissions, worsened air and water pollution, and driven up the price of food and feed." And I know that many of my colleagues are very concerned about carbon emissions. So separate and apart from ozone, CO2 that's being released into the atmosphere is a concern for a lot of people. Studies show that ethanol creates more carbon dioxide emission than gasoline. It's just a fact. The Clean Air Task Force estimates that the carbon emissions from corn ethanol over the next 30 years at current projected consumption rates would exceed 1.4 billion tons. That's 300 million tons more than if we used gasoline instead of the ethanol. So there really isn't any debate that I'm aware of anymore about this. Air quality is better if we're not using ethanol than when we are. But there are other impacts of this mandate. One is the higher cost on families. The fact is, ethanol is more expensive to make per unit of energy than gasoline. So you need to spend more for your car to go the same distance. The New York Times reported that ethanol increased costs on gasoline purchase by billions of dollars in 2013. The Wall Street Journal estimated that in 2014 alone, the RFS mandate, this mandate that we burn ethanol in our gas, raised the cost of gas by an average of anywhere from $128 to $320 per year for the average family. So let's be very clear. This mandate is costing American families several $100s a year of their disposable income they're having to spend to buy the more expensive fuel to move their vehicles. It's not just the direct effect of having to pay more when you gas up your car. These ethanol mandates take a huge segment of our corn production off the market, and they drive up the price of corn. Again, this isn't just me saying so. In 2008, the USDA Secretary Ed Schaefer and Department of Energy Secretary Samuel Bodman acknowledged that ethanol increases the food price. Their estimate is about just under 1% per year. And in 2012, a study by economist Thomas Elam observed that ethanol increases food costs for the average family of four by just over $2,000 per year. So the increased food costs is actually multiples of the increased gasoline costs when we fill up our tanks, and families are hit by both. Of course, the food cost goes up not only because of the direct effect of higher corn, and many of us consume corn directly, but corn is the principal feed for all livestock. And so meat and poultry, the price of meat and poultry is very, very much correlated to the cost of the feed, and we make that feed much more expensive than it needs to be because of the ethanol mandate. There's another way in which this mandate is harmful to consumers and families, and that is that it increases engine maintenance costs. The EPA acknowledges that ethanol is harmful to engines. As they say, and I quote, "Unlike other fuel components, ethanol is corrosive and highly water soluble." Gasoline is not. So gasoline doesn't have this physical property. It doesn't damage engines, but ethanol does. The moisture that's dissolved in ethanol is corrosive. And in fact, the EPA warns that fuel blends containing as little as 15% ethanol, which, by the way, this year, there will be gas stations selling gasoline that is 15% ethanol. It should not be used in any motorcycle, school bus, transit bus, delivery truck, boat, ATV, lawnmower, or older automobile because of the damage that we know the ethanol will do to these engines. The AAA warns that the rising ethanol content, just rising above 10%, which is where we are, they say that this will damage 95% of the cars that are on the road today. How can this possibly be good for a family to be systematically degrading the engines in their vehicles? There's other ways in which this is damaging to our economy. I mentioned that part of the reason that food prices for families is higher as a result of the ethanol mandate is because corn is such an important source of food for livestock. Well, in fact, the The Federal Reserve and the USDA estimate that the ethanol mandate alone has contributed to a 20 to 30% increase in corn prices, and that has had a terrible impact on livestock operations and dairy industry. It's also bad for American refineries. There are 137 oil refineries. They operate in 28 states. They employ thousands of people with good family-sustaining jobs. But because the oil refiner has to either blend in ethanol with the gasoline they make, or they have to go out and pay a fine, a penalty essentially, if they don't, it diminishes jobs in the refining sector. Again, this isn't just my opinion. I got a letter from the AFL-CIO, Philadelphia AFL-CIO business manager, Pat Gillespie. And I'm going to quote a little bit from the letter because he lays it out very clearly. He says, and I quote, "Our resurrected refinery in Trainer, Pennsylvania, once again needs your intercession. The impact of the dramatic spike in the cost of the RIN credits," that's the system by which the EPA enforces the ethanol mandate, "the increase from 4 cents to $1 per gallon will cause a tremendous depression in our refinery's bottom line. Of course, at the building trades, we need them to have the economic vitality to bring about the construction and maintenance projects that our members depend on. And the steel workers, of course, need economic vitality so they can maintain and expand their jobs with the refinery. We need your help with this matter." I completely agree. This is disastrous policy. So just to summarize, Mr. President, corn ethanol, ethanol generally, but corn ethanol in particular, this is just bad policy. It's bad for the environment. It increases air pollution. It raises costs for families to drive their vehicles, to put food on the table, and it costs us jobs. It damages the economy. So let's end this practice. Let's end this entire mandate. It was well-intentioned at the time, I'm sure, but now it's clear that it's doing harm. It's not doing good. And let me close on one other point, Mr. President, because I think we have to make this. You know, we here in Congress, we in Washington, should not be forcing taxpayers and consumers to subsidize certain industries at the expense of others. That's what's going on here. The magnitude of the consumption of ethanol is entirely driven by the mandates that Congress has required the EPA to impose. That's why this is happening. And so we use the power of government to force consumers to pay more than they need to be paying to drive their car, to buy their food. This makes no sense at all. And you know, this presidential campaign, it seems to me, a big part of what we're hearing on both sides of the aisle in this very unusual and raucous presidential election cycle is voters who are disgusted with Washington. They don't trust Washington. They don't have a very high opinion of Congress. And part of it is because they're convinced that Congress goes around doling out special favors for special industries and special groups and the politically well-connected. Well, guess what? They're right. And this is an egregious example of that. A clear example where the taxpayer and the consumer get stuck with a bill so as to benefit a selected preferred industry that has a lot of political clout. It's outrageous. The American people are right to be angry and to be tired of this. So, Mr. President, we should end the renewable fuel standards entirely. As I say, it started with good intentions, but the evidence is in. There's no more mystery anymore. Policy that is bad for the environment, bad for families, bad for budgets, and bad for our economy. There's no reason that we should be continuing to this, and I urge my colleagues to support this and any other effort to completely eliminate the renewable fuel standard, and if we can't do that, to at least take the 80% out that is comprised of the corn component. I yield the floor.